At 05:47 hours on the morning of June 7, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Peter Lansdowne stood on the bridge of HMS Durban, watching the French coastline through salt-sprayed binoculars 800 yards away. The old cruiser's engines were silent. Her guns were empty. Her crew had been reduced to a skeleton staff of 47 men, whose only remaining mission was to kill their own ship. 39 years old, veteran of the Great War, zero experience deliberately sinking vessels. Behind him, stretched across 5 miles of channel water, 69 other ships waited for the same order. Battleships built before the Great War, merchant steamers that had crossed the Atlantic 100 times, freighters too old for combat duty. The British Admiralty called them corn cobs. The sailors called them something else. They called them the Graveyard Fleet. 24 hours earlier, American and British forces had stormed 5 beaches in Normandy. 156,000 men, 11,000 aircraft, 7,000 ships, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. But now, with the beaches secured and troops pushing inland, the Allied command faced a problem that threatened to strangle the entire invasion before it could succeed. Supply ships. Every hour, thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment needed to reach the beaches. But the same German coastal artillery that had failed to stop the initial landing was now targeting the supply vessels offshore. The Nazi batteries positioned on the cliffs commanded perfect fields of fire over the approach routes. A 155mm shell could sink a Liberty ship with a single hit. The Germans had dozens of these guns positioned along the coast between Cherbourg and Caen. The Allies needed harbors, deep water ports where supply ships could unload safely, protected from both German guns and Channel storms. But the nearest major port was Cherbourg, 20 miles northwest, still held by 40,000 German troops commanded by Generalleutnant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben. The second nearest was Le Havre, 50 miles northeast, also occupied and heavily fortified. Military planners estimated it would take 3 to 4 weeks to capture either port, and even then the Germans would demolish the facilities before surrendering. Cherbourg's commander had already received orders directly from Berlin to destroy every crane, every pier, every warehouse, every fuel depot before allowing capture. Hitler had been explicit: leave the Allies nothing but rubble. The invasion was succeeding. But without supply lines, the Allied armies would be trapped on the beaches, cut off from reinforcement, vulnerable to counterattack. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had developed a strategy specifically for this scenario. Let the Allies land, let them establish a beachhead, then strangle their supply lines and bottle them up on the coast while panzer divisions assembled for a massive counterattack that would drive the invasion force back into the sea. Von Rundstedt had watched the Dieppe disaster in 1942. He knew the Allies could take beaches. He also knew they could not hold them without ports. British engineers had anticipated this problem. Their solution had been designed 18 months earlier in November 1942, approved by Winston Churchill himself, and constructed in absolute secrecy at shipyards across England and Scotland. The solution was called Operation Gooseberry, and on paper it looked completely insane. The plan was to take 70 ships, sail them to predetermined positions off the Normandy coast, and deliberately sink them to create artificial breakwaters. The sunken hulls would form a protective barrier approximately 6 miles long across all 5 landing beaches. Inside these barriers, supply vessels could anchor safely, protected from both German artillery and rough seas. The artificial harbors would remain operational until the Allies could capture and repair actual ports. Each gooseberry would provide protection for approximately 1 mile of beach, 5 gooseberries, 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. When Churchill first presented the concept to his military commanders in December 1943, the initial reaction was skepticism. Scuttle 70 perfectly good ships? Ships that could be used for transport, patrol duty, convoy escort? Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, who would command the naval forces for D-Day, questioned whether the Royal Navy could spare that many vessels. The Navy was already stretched thin across the Atlantic, protecting convoys from U-boats, in the Mediterranean supporting operations in Italy, and in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. Dedicating 70 vessels to be used as underwater obstacles seemed wasteful at best, strategically foolish at worst. Churchill insisted. He had seen the disaster at Dieppe in August 1942, when Canadian forces attempted to capture a fortified port in a frontal assault. Of the 6,000 men who went ashore at Dieppe, 3,500 were killed, wounded, or captured within 9 hours. The raid proved that capturing defended ports was nearly impossible. The Germans had spent years fortifying every major harbor on the French coast. Concrete bunkers, overlapping fields of fire, demolition charges pre-positioned on every dock and crane. The Allies could not count on taking Cherbourg or any other harbor in time to sustain an invasion. They would have to bring their own harbors with them. Churchill's exact words to his chiefs of staff were, "They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves." That was Churchill's management style. Present the impossible problem, demand solutions, ignore objections. The logistics were staggering. The ships selected for Operation Gooseberry included obsolete battleships like HMS Centurion, built in 1911, and the French battleship Courbet, built in 1913, elderly cruisers like HMS Durban, commissioned in 1921, merchant vessels that had survived decades of Atlantic crossings, steamers that had been pulled from retirement specifically for this mission. Some of these ships were older than the men who would scuttle them. Each ship had to be prepared for scuttling. Crews installed special seacocks that could be opened to flood compartments rapidly. Engineers placed explosive charges at strategic points in the hull. Everything had to be calculated. The ships needed to sink quickly enough that they would not drift off position, but slowly enough that crews could evacuate safely. The ships needed to settle on the bottom at precise depths. Too deep, and they would provide no protection from waves. Too shallow, and they would be exposed at low tide and vulnerable to complete destruction by German artillery. British engineers spent months calculating tides, currents, seabed composition. The Normandy coast was not uniform. Some areas had sandy bottoms, others had rock or clay. Each gooseberry site required different positioning strategies. At Utah Beach, the water was relatively shallow with a sandy bottom. Ships could be positioned closer together. At Sword Beach, the water was deeper with a rocky bottom. Ships needed to be spaced farther apart to account for settling patterns. By early June 1944, the Gooseberry fleet had assembled at various ports along England's southern coast: Portland, Portsmouth, Southampton, the Solent. The ships were divided into groups corresponding to their assigned beaches. Each group had a designated leader, usually a naval officer with extensive navigation experience. The operation required precise timing. The ships could not sail too early, or German reconnaissance aircraft would spot the unusual convoy and realize something significant was planned. They could not sail too late, or the beaches would be vulnerable during the critical resupply period immediately after D-Day. Intelligence estimated that German coastal artillery could sink up to 30% of supply vessels if they had to operate in exposed anchorages. That level of losses would cripple the invasion within a week. On June 6th, D-Day, the invasion began at 6:30 hours. The Gooseberry fleet remained in port. Their orders were to wait for confirmation that the beaches had been secured and that Operation Overlord was proceeding as planned before crossing the channel. If the invasion failed, if the Allied forces were driven back to the sea as they had been at Dieppe, the Blockships would not be needed. The vessels would be returned to whatever service they could still provide. Throughout June 6th, Lansdowne and the other Gooseberry captains monitored radio reports from Normandy. The news was mixed. At Utah Beach, American forces had landed with relatively light casualties and were moving inland. At Omaha Beach, American forces had taken devastating casualties and were pinned down on the beach for hours before finally breaking through German defenses. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces had established solid beachheads. By 1800 hours on June 6th, approximately 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. The invasion had succeeded. Now came the harder part, keeping them supplied. By midnight on June 6th, the situation was clear enough for Operation Gooseberry to proceed. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force sent coded orders to all Gooseberry groups. Execute. Move to assigned positions at first light. Scuttle on arrival. At 2:30 hours on June 7th, the Gooseberry fleet began departing from British ports. 70 ships. Some were towed by tugboats because their engines were too unreliable for the Channel crossing. Others steamed under their own power for the final voyage. The crossing would take approximately 6 to 8 hours depending on individual ship speed and sea conditions. The Channel was relatively calm that morning, with 2 to 3 foot swells and light winds from the west. Good conditions for the operation. The ships moved slowly. Many had skeleton crews, just enough men to steer, monitor the engines, and operate the scuttling equipment. Full crews would have been wasted manpower. These ships were going to the bottom. No point risking more lives than necessary. As dawn broke on June 7th, the Gooseberry fleet approached the Normandy coast. German coastal batteries immediately opened fire. The Blockships were large, slow-moving targets silhouetted against the rising sun. Shell splashes erupted around them. The German gunners had excellent optics and years of training. They knew how to lead moving targets. They knew how to adjust for wind and distance. Some vessels were hit. The American Liberty ship James Iredell, assigned to Gooseberry 2 at Omaha Beach, took a direct hit from a German 150mm battery positioned near Pointe du Hoc. The shell penetrated the forward hold and detonated inside, killing 6 of the 23-man skeleton crew. But the ship remained afloat long enough to reach her assigned position. The destroyer USS Corey had been sunk by German mines on June 6th, but her wreck was incorporated into Gooseberry 1 at Utah Beach. The remaining Allied escort vessels, destroyers and corvettes, laid down smokescreens and engaged the coastal batteries with counter-battery fire, giving the Blockships time to reach their positions. At Utah Beach, Gooseberry 1 consisted of 10 ships positioned in a careful line approximately 1 mile offshore, running parallel to the beach. The USS Corey wreck marked the western end. The other 9 ships, a mix of American Liberty ships and British merchantmen, filled in the line heading east. At Omaha Beach, Gooseberry 2 required 15 ships to create adequate protection because Omaha was longer and more exposed to prevailing winds. At Gold Beach, 16 ships formed Gooseberry 3. At Juno Beach, Gooseberry 4 used 13 ships. At Sword Beach, Gooseberry 5, the easternmost breakwater, consisted of 16 ships including HMS Durban and the French battleship Corbeil. Lieutenant Commander Lansdowne on HMS Durban had been given specific coordinates and a specific heading. Navigate to 49.3167 degrees north, 0.3167 degrees west. Align ship on heading 270 degrees, bow pointing west. Scuttle at 0547 hours. Lansdowne had checked his charts dozens of times during the crossing. The positioning had to be perfect. If Durban settled even 50 yards off position, she could create a gap in Gooseberry 5 that would allow waves through and negate the protection for dozens of supply ships. At 5:47, Lansdowne reached his assigned position off Sword Beach. Around him, other ships from Gooseberry 5 were taking their places. The French battleship Corbeil was settling into position 200 yards to his east. The merchant steamer Empire Tamar was approaching from the west. The Dover Hill was positioning herself farther down the line. Each captain had to align his vessel perfectly. Too far apart and gaps would allow waves through. Too close together and the overlapping hulls would create weak points where wreckage could shift and destabilize the breakwater. Lansdowne gave the order. Open seacocks, blow charges, all hands to lifeboats. Engineers in the engine room opened the massive seacocks. Seawater rushed in at hundreds of gallons per second. Simultaneously, explosive charges detonated in compartments below the waterline. The charges had been positioned by Royal Navy demolition experts to create controlled flooding. Too much explosive, and the ship could break apart and drift in pieces. Too little, and the flooding would take too long. HMS Durban's charges were perfectly calibrated. The hull ruptured in 3 places. Cold channel water rushed into the lower decks. The ship began to list to port. The skeleton crew assembled on the main deck, ready to abandon ship. The 4 lifeboats had been prepared before arrival, already swung out on their davits, ready to be lowered. Lansdowne was the last man off HMS Durban. Naval tradition, the captain leaves last. He climbed down into the final lifeboat at 5:54, 7 minutes after giving the scuttling order. The lifeboat pushed away from Durban's hull. Lansdowne watched his ship die. She was going down by the bow, stern rising. Water was pouring through the shell holes, through the ruptured seacocks, flooding compartments one after another. The list increased. 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees. At 6:04, HMS Durban reached equilibrium. She settled on the channel bottom with her deck approximately 6 feet below the surface at high tide. Her superstructure, the bridge, the forward gun turrets, remained above water, exactly as planned. The engineering calculations had been perfect. Durban would now serve as a permanent fixture, breaking waves, providing calm water for the supply ships that would soon fill the protected anchorage. Around Lansdowne, the other ships of Gooseberry 5 were going through the same process. The French battleship Courbet, a veteran of World War I, settled next to Durban at 6:11. Courbet had fought at the Battle of Antivari in 1914. She had survived 30 years of service. Now she would spend eternity as a breakwater off Normandy. The Empire. Tamar sank at 6:18, the Becheville at 6:23, the Dover Hill at 6:29, the Allenbank at 6:35. One by one, the ships of Gooseberry 5 went down, creating an artificial reef that broke the incoming swells and provided calm water on the lee side. By 900 hours on June 7th, all 5 Gooseberry breakwaters were in place. The operation had taken less than 4 hours from arrival to completion. 70 ships sunk in predetermined positions across 6 miles of coastline. 0 ships lost to enemy action before reaching their positions, though several had been damaged. The coordination was remarkable. 70 captains, 70 ships, all arriving at precise locations within minutes of schedule, all scuttling according to plan, all settling exactly where they were supposed to settle. Supply ships immediately began using the protected anchorages, Liberty ships loaded with ammunition, fuel, and rations. LSTS carrying tanks and trucks, smaller cargo vessels bringing medical supplies, spare parts, and mail from home. They all crowded into the sheltered water behind the Blockships. The difference was immediately apparent. Outside the breakwaters, waves ran 4 to 6 feet, typical for the channel in June. Inside the protected areas, the water was nearly calm, with swells reduced to less than 2 feet. Landing craft could approach the beaches in relative safety. Larger ships could anchor and offload cargo into smaller vessels without fear of being swamped. The German coastal batteries continued firing throughout June 7th and into June 8th. But the Blockships absorbed hits that would have sunk loaded cargo vessels. The sunken hulls were already on the bottom. They could not be sunk twice. German artillery scored direct hits on multiple Blockships over the following days. The HMS Centurion, positioned in Gooseberry 3 at Gold Beach, took 14 hits from German 105mm guns over a 3-day period. Each hit blasted chunks of steel and superstructure into the air, but Centurion remained in position. The wreck was immovable. The Germans were wasting ammunition shooting at ships that were already dead. By June 9th, German commanders realized the scuttled ships were not temporary obstacles. They were permanent breakwaters. Intelligence reports reached German headquarters describing the artificial harbors. The reports were initially dismissed as impossible. No military force would deliberately destroy 70 ships just to create breakwaters. But reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the reports. Photographs showed the regular line of sunken vessels, the calm water behind them, the hundreds of supply ships using the protected anchorages. The Gooseberry breakwaters proved so effective that Allied engineers immediately began constructing 2 full artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberry A and Mulberry B, around Gooseberries 2 and 3 at Omaha and Gold Beaches. These harbors included massive concrete caissons called phoenixes, each weighing 6,000 tons. The phoenixes were floated across the channel and then sunk in precise positions to extend the breakwaters created by the Gooseberry block ships. Floating roadways called whales, constructed from steel and concrete, connected the phoenixes to the shore. Pierheads called spuds provided deep water berths where Liberty ships could tie up and unload directly without needing to transfer cargo to smaller landing craft. The Mulberry harbors were engineering marvels. They had been designed, constructed, and assembled in less than 8 months. Each harbor could handle 7,000 tons of supplies per day, but they were built upon the foundation created by the humble Blockships of Operation Gooseberry. Without the Gooseberries providing the initial wave protection, the Mulberry harbors could not have been constructed. The Phoenixes were too heavy to be positioned in rough water. The whales would have been torn apart by storm waves. The Gooseberries made everything possible. On June 19th, the worst channel storm in 40 years struck Normandy. Weather forecasters had not predicted it. The storm developed rapidly over the Atlantic and slammed into the French coast with winds exceeding 40 knots. Waves reached heights of 8 feet. The storm lasted 3 days, from June 19th through June 22nd. Mulberry A, the American artificial harbor at Omaha Beach, was destroyed. The concrete Phoenixes, each weighing 6,000 tons, broke loose from their moorings. Several were driven onto the beach and smashed. Pier sections collapsed. The floating whale roadways were torn apart and scattered across miles of coastline. By the time the storm passed, Mulberry A was a total loss. American engineers estimated it would take 3 months to rebuild. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force made the decision not to rebuild. The resources would be better spent elsewhere. The Americans would have to rely on Gooseberry II and captured ports. But the Gooseberry breakwaters held, all 5 of them. The Blockships, already on the bottom, immovable, absorbed the worst the channel could throw at them. Waves crashed over their decks. Wind tore away loose pieces of superstructure, but the hulls remained in position. At Utah Beach, American forces continued unloading supplies throughout the storm thanks to Gooseberry I. The sunken ships broke the worst of the waves, reducing 8-foot swells to 3-foot rollers. Landing craft could still operate. Smaller supply vessels continued ferrying cargo ashore. Operations slowed but never stopped. At Sword Beach, British forces using Gooseberry V maintained 70% of normal supply operations during the storm. Without the Gooseberries, operations would have stopped completely for 3 days. The British Mulberry B at Gold Beach survived the storm with moderate damage because Gooseberry III protected it. Several Phoenix caissons shifted but remained functional. The whale roadways flexed but held together. Engineers spent a week on repairs, and by June 29th, Mulberry B was back to full operational capacity. Between D-Day and the end of June, the Gooseberries facilitated the landing of over 850,000 men, 148,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies. At Utah Beach alone, American forces averaged 10,000 tons of supplies per day throughout June, most of it unloaded in the protected waters of Gooseberry I. The British Mulberry B at Gold Beach, protected by Gooseberry III, handled 6,000 tons per day. Even after Mulberry A was destroyed, American forces at Omaha Beach continued operations using just Gooseberry II, processing 4,000 tons per day in an open roadstead with no pier facilities. Landing craft would ferry supplies from anchored ships to the beach, inefficient but functional. Without Gooseberry II providing wave protection, even that would have been impossible. German commanders were stunned. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt had assumed the Allies would be vulnerable during the resupply phase. His strategy of bottling up the invasion force depended on the Allies struggling to maintain supply lines without captured ports. Von Rundstedt had watched Allied supply operations through June and could not understand how they were sustaining such high tonnage rates without using Cherbourg or any other major harbor. When he finally received intelligence reports about the Gooseberries and Mulberries, he reportedly told his staff that the war was lost. If the Allies could create harbors from nothing, they could sustain operations indefinitely. German forces in Normandy would be ground down by superior Allied numbers and superior Allied logistics. The outcome was now inevitable. Cherbourg finally fell to American forces on June 27th, 21 days after D-Day. By that time, the Gooseberries had already processed more tonnage than Cherbourg's port facilities could have handled, even if they had been captured intact. And they were not captured intact. German engineers had spent the final days before surrender systematically destroying everything. They sank ships to block the harbor entrance. They demolished every crane. They destroyed fuel storage facilities. They planted thousands of mines. American engineers spent 6 weeks clearing Cherbourg before the port could handle any significant cargo. The first Liberty ship did not unload at Cherbourg until August 16th, more than 2 months after D-Day. By that time, the Gooseberries had long since served their purpose. After the war, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and architect of German coastal defenses, admitted that Operation Gooseberry had completely negated 2 years of German defensive construction. The Atlantic Wall had consumed 13 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.5 million tons of steel. Hundreds of thousands of forced laborers, many of them prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, had built bunkers, gun emplacements, and fortified positions all along the French coast from Norway to Spain. The entire defensive philosophy was based on the assumption that the Allies would need to capture existing ports to sustain an invasion. The assumption was wrong. 2 weeks after D-Day, Speer realized the entire German defensive strategy had been defeated by what he called an idea of simple genius. In his memoirs, Speer wrote, "We never considered that the Allies would bring their own harbors. That single oversight cost us France." The scuttled ships remained in position for months after D-Day. Some of them remained there permanently. After the war, salvage operations removed portions of many wrecks. Scrap metal was valuable in post-war Europe. Salvage companies used explosives to break up accessible sections of the Blockships and hauled the pieces away. But complete removal was never attempted. The hulls were too deeply embedded in the seabed. Decades of storms had shifted sand and silt around them. The wrecks had become part of the sea floor, and there was no economic incentive to fully clear them. They were not navigation hazards. They were not blocking shipping lanes. They were just wrecks in shallow water off beaches that had returned to peaceful civilian use. Today, the remains of the Gooseberry breakwaters are popular diving sites. Off Sword Beach, recreational divers can still explore the wreckage of HMS Durban, the French battleship Courbet, and other vessels from Gooseberry 5. The hulls are heavily deteriorated, encrusted with marine growth, colonized by fish and crustaceans. But they are recognizable. Brass fittings, portholes, sections of deck plating all remain visible 80 years later. The ships have become artificial reefs, supporting marine ecosystems that did not exist before D-Day. Divers report seeing lobsters in the engine rooms, schools of fish around the gun turrets, eels living in the crew quarters. The ships that died for the invasion are now full of life. French authorities have designated several Gooseberry wrecks as protected historical sites. Removing artifacts is prohibited. The ships are war graves. Some of them still contain the remains of crew members who died during the scuttling operations or from German artillery fire. Divers are asked to treat the sites with respect. These are not just interesting wrecks. They are monuments to the men who sailed them to Normandy, knowing they would never return. Local communities along the Normandy coast have erected memorials to Operation Gooseberry. Small plaques, monuments in village squares, informational displays at beach parking areas. Most tourists who visit Normandy know about Omaha Beach, about the American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, about the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. Fewer know about the Gooseberries. The ships that made it all possible receive less attention than the battles they enabled, but the locals remember. Fishermen from villages along the coast still use the wrecks as landmarks. The old-timers remember watching the ships sink in June 1944. They remember the supply convoys using the protected anchorages. They remember liberation. The ships that formed Operation Gooseberry were never intended to be heroes. They were obsolete vessels, too old for combat, too worn out for regular service, destined for the scrapyard or the breaker's yard. The crews that sailed them to Normandy were skeleton staffs, men whose primary qualification was knowing how to properly scuttle a ship. There were no medals for sinking your own vessel, no commendations for captains who successfully destroyed what they had spent their careers trying to preserve. Lieutenant Commander Lansdowne received no decoration for scuttling HMS Durban. His official service record lists the operation as vessel lost, scuttled per orders, a bureaucratic notation for an act that contributed to the liberation of Europe. But those 70 ships, in their final active service, accomplished something no battleship or aircraft carrier could have achieved. They provided the foundation for the entire Normandy invasion supply chain. They turned exposed beaches into protected harbors. They negated the German coastal artillery threat. They survived the worst storm in 40 years. They allowed the Allied armies to receive the continuous stream of reinforcements and supplies necessary to break out from the beachhead and begin the liberation of Europe. By the end of August 1944, over 2 million Allied troops had landed in Normandy. Most of them came ashore through beaches protected by the Gooseberry breakwaters. Most of their supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, everything they needed to fight came through those same protected anchorages. The strategic impact of Operation Gooseberry extended beyond logistics. The operation demonstrated Allied engineering capability and strategic thinking. German commanders had spent years preparing defenses based on assumptions about Allied capabilities. The Gooseberries proved those assumptions wrong. If the Allies could create artificial harbors, what else could they do? The psychological impact on German morale was significant. Von Rundstedt's confidence in holding France evaporated when he realized the Allies had solved the supply problem. Junior German officers reported declining morale among coastal defense troops who realized they were fighting an enemy that could apparently overcome any obstacle through sheer engineering and industrial power. After D-Day, Allied engineers applied the lessons learned from Operation Gooseberry to other operations. When planning the invasion of southern France in August 1944, Operation Dragoon, engineers included plans for artificial breakwaters using scuttled ships. When planning potential operations against the Japanese home islands, the United States Navy considered constructing massive artificial harbors using hundreds of ships. The Japanese surrender in August 1945 made those plans unnecessary, but the planning documents reveal how seriously military commanders took the Gooseberry concept. In post-war military education, Operation Gooseberry became a standard case study in logistics, engineering, and strategic planning. The operation demonstrated the importance of solving logistical challenges before they became operational crises. The operation showed that unconventional solutions could be more effective than conventional approaches. The operation proved that careful planning and precise execution could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. Military academies around the world still teach Operation Gooseberry in courses on amphibious operations and logistics. The ships themselves have mostly faded from memory. HMS Durban is a dive site. The French battleship Corbeil is a rusted hulk slowly disintegrating in the channel. The merchant steamers and freighters that made up the bulk of the Gooseberry fleets are known only to historians and local divers, but their contribution remains. Every Allied soldier who fought in northwestern Europe in 1944 and 1945 depended on the supply chain those ships made possible. Every tank, every artillery shell, every K-ration, every pair of boots, every gallon of fuel, everything came through the beaches those ships protected. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about the ingenious solutions and unsung heroes that won the war. Real history, real courage, real innovation. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Operation Gooseberry doesn't disappear into silence. These ships deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.